Guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today we are talking about my worst books of 2020. So by now you will have already seen my most disappointing and also my most surprising books of 2020, and tomorrow you will get my best books of 2020. But for now we are talking about the books that I read last year that I really did not like. I don't consider myself to be a tea spiller, but if you are somebody who does not like to hear people talk negatively about books, then this is your final warning to leave because we are about to get started. So the first book I'm going to be talking about today is Stronger, Faster and More Beautiful by Arwen Ellis Dayton. This is a book that was recommended to me because I really like sci-fi. However, I do like to stipulate that generally I really like heavily logic-based sci-fi, and this was not it. So this is a almost collection of short stories. We are following 6 teenagers in this book at varying points in the future. So the first story is told at a point in the future that is closest to us, and as we progress through these 6 stories we get further and further into the future. These stories are all supposed to be connected and linked together. I would say that they are barely linked together, which is one of the main problems I had with this, but they are supposed to be connected. The theme of all of these stories is genetic modification, and it is supposed to be a hypothetical what if, like a look at what could possibly happen if medical technology and science continue to progress in the way they are, where we could end up at this hypothetical future point. So the first 3 stories in this book I thought were okay. I didn't love them, but they were alright. I don't like the writing style in this book. It is very simplistic, which I can get on board with and I enjoy sometimes if the story is good, but because I didn't like other elements of this as well, just generally wasn't a fan with the whole package here. But the first 3 stories were okay. We start at a very believable point with 2 sick twins. One of them is in a coma and the other one's organs are failing, but they are still mobile. They are less sick than the other one, and they are both in hospital, and the dying twins' organs are going to be harvested and spliced with the healthier twins' organs to make a healthier human, which, you know, makes sense with medical technology advancements. Being able to save one twin is better than losing them both. So it progressed in increments like this throughout the first 3 stories, and by story 4 I was just not enjoying it anymore. I believe that the 4th story focused on a boy who had been spliced with like some fish DNA so that he could work at an underwater organ harvesting farm, which I didn't quite get. And by the time we get to the end story, we have flying people with wings that are dissolving. So the reason that I didn't like this is that I just did not find it cohesive. I did not find it believable at all. As I mentioned, all of these stories are supposed to be connected. They are not connected by scientific advancement. This book is not grounded in like scientific theory or like accurate projections. One of the things that I really love about Becky Chambers, for example, is that you can tell that everything that she is hypothesizing is rooted in science, and it makes it a believable possible future. This had absolutely none of that, and everything was tied together by this one man who was a preacher in the first story who was against genetic modification. He links the entire thing together. They are not linked together by theme. We have different themes of genetic modification through here. It's not a consistent advancement of the same type of genetic modification. For me, things like this have to be believable because the core of science fiction is that it is grounded in science. So when the research is not done there, when it is not a realistic projection of what could happen, I mean, these things could happen, but I would like to have seen the journey of getting from this point with the sick twins to the flying people with dissolving wings, and it wasn't there for me. The next one we have is The Raven and the Dove by Caitlin Davis. This is a indie fantasy romance that I was really excited about because throughout 2020, as you guys know, I have been exploring fantasy romance and I have been particularly enjoying indie books, and this one is a young adult fantasy Tristan and Isolde retelling. So the world that this is set in is this series of floating islands that used to be on the surface of the earth, and the people of these floating islands believe that because of their belief in the gods, the islands were raised into the sky to take the people away from oppressive magic wielders on earth. Every so often on the summer solstice, all of the ruling families of all of these islands come together and they have something called the courting trials, which is where a boy and a girl from from each royal family compete in this series of trials, and the ones who place the highest get to select who they are going to marry. Every one of the islands is represented by a different kind of bird because all of these people have wings, and the main houses we are following is the doves from the House of Peace and the ravens from the House of Whispers. Very early on in this story we are introduced to the two raven princes, which are Rafe and Xander, and we very quickly find out that Xander has a disability, and because of this he asks his brother, who is a bastard prince, to stand in and take part in the trials in his stead, because it is very important that the ravens secure a strong mate as they are currently ruling a failing kingdom. So Rafe grudgingly agrees to do this, and he ends up falling in love with the princess of the most powerful house, which is Lyanna, who is the princess of the doves and the House of Peace. Very quickly Lyanna finds out that the man that she's fallen in love with is not actually the one that she's going to marry. She will instead be marrying Rafe's brother. There are other things going on in the background. There is a spy amongst the cast of main characters. There is also a king on Earth, and it was promising. I was really excited to read this. My main problem, I had quite a few problems with it, but one of the main ones is that considering that this book is 500 pages, I did not find any aspects of it to be particularly well developed. The king that I mentioned on Earth, I believe, is one of the main antagonists of this book, and by the time I got to the end of it I still could not figure out what his main motives were and figure out how he is going to integrate into the story at any point. Because we have quite a wide range of character perspectives, I did feel that this stopped me from really being connected to the characters. My favourite character in here was the bastard prince Rafe, and that is because out of everybody I think he is the only one who was truly well developed. He felt guilt for a lot of reasons, and he truly hated himself because of some of the things in his past and things that he's done and things that have been done to him, and I think that he is the only member of this cast of characters who had really strong, believable motives throughout this story. I kind of have conflicting opinions on the length of this book, because while it was 500 pages and I felt like nothing was thoroughly well explored, I do also think that it could have been shorter, because the actual content that was in there that we got I don't think needed to be spread over 500 pages. But overall this read like a really long prologue, and the sequel has already been released now. I don't think I'm going to be reading it, seeing as the first book is in my worst books of the year video, but I am kind of intrigued, as the first book felt like a really long prologue, to see what element is introduced in the second book and whether everything starts to tie together a little bit. The next one we have is Maybe Now by Colleen Hoover. I feel kind of bad about having this in my worst books of the year because I don't have overly strong feelings about it. I read quite a lot of Colleen Hoover. Colleen Hoover is my go-to author to get me out of a reading slump because she writes really angsty, dramatic romance. I particularly like her new adult, but she has written in young adult and adult as well. I do like her adult work, but I have noticed that I definitely prefer her standalones to her series, because of everything I've read from her so far, every standalone I've read has got 3 stars or more, but every series I read has had one book in the series that gets a really low rating and ends up on my worst books of the year. So this is a 2-book series, but it does have a novella as well, and Maybe Now is the second book in the series. In this series we are following Sydney and Ridge, and Sydney lives with her boyfriend and her roommate, who is also one of her best friends, and every night at 8 p.m. she goes out onto her balcony to listen to the boy who lives across the complex, who is Ridge, play guitar. Now she sings along and kind of just makes up lyrics as she goes, and he notices her doing this and holds up a board with his phone number on and says, like, will you text me these lyrics, because he actually writes songs for his brother's band. So they start writing songs together, and in the process of this Sydney finds out that her boyfriend has been cheating on her with her roommate, so she has to move out as fast as possible and she ends up living with Ridge. So I did enjoy the first book. It's not one of my favorite Colleen Hoovers, but I enjoyed it. I also really enjoyed the novella, but this sequel just felt fan servicey. I do know that it was published on Wattpad. I don't believe that the first one was, so it kind of felt like this was an add-on for the fans, because I just don't think that Sydney and Ridge's relationship needed anything else adding to it. In the first book, the development of them as characters and how they relate to each other is really quite sweet, and they are one of the sweeter couples that Colleen Hoover has written. The second book just felt like it was adding drama for the sake of drama, and I am a big fan of drama and angst. It is the reason why I read Colleen Hoover. However, I did find the sequels to be very contradictory. There are certain things like extenuating circumstances that characters had previously agreed to in book 1 that they had suddenly decided in book 2 that they didn't agree to anymore, and they didn't want this happening anymore, which just felt very counterproductive. Everyone was kind of talking in circles, re-resolving things that had already been discussed in book 1, and the whole thing just felt really unnecessary. There were elements of this that I liked. I really liked the characters of Maggie and Jake. Maggie is a side character from the first book, and Jake is a new character introduced in this book, and I do actually think that I would have enjoyed this a lot more if it would have been about Maggie and Jake, with Sydney and Ridge as side characters. Next up we have Never Contended Things by Sarah Porter. I picked this up because it is a dark fairy story. It contains like a borderline incest that isn't actually incest, but given the nature of the relationship it is kinda, which I will get into as I'm talking about it. But I really like dark stories, I really like fairy stories, and I wanted so much more from this than it gave me. However, what I will say is that this is definitely a style thing. The style and the way this book is written, it's just not to my taste. But this is a young adult fantasy series that follows foster siblings Keza and Josh, which is why I said it's kind of incesty but not really incesty, because they're only foster siblings, but they have been foster siblings for a considerable amount of time since the oldest of them was like 12. So Josh is hopelessly in love with Keza, and Keza isn't feeling it so much, but she adores Josh. He's her foster brother. They've spent a lot of time together, they've had very rough lives, and they enjoy each other's company. So the main crux of this story is that Keza is about to turn 18 and her foster parents don't like her very much, they only like Josh. So she is about to leave after her 18th birthday and go to a group home, and Josh and Keza desperately do not want to be separated. One day they are just out roaming around the town and they come across this group of very attractive, very mesmerizing strangers who do turn out to be fairies, and shortly after this encounter Josh goes missing. So Keza does everything in her power to try and find him, and they do end up both sucked into this alternate reality dimension, which is essentially a fairy world that kind of mirrors the real world. So one thing worth noting, and something that I didn't like about this, is that the characters are very unlikable and there is a lot of toxic relationships in here. That being said, the point of the story is the toxic relationship elements. So Keza and Josh have both had a very rough start in life, and one of the main themes of this book is people in hopeless situations clinging onto the only good things in their life, which in relation to Keza and Josh, the thing that they're clinging onto is each other. It's an exploration in how things like this do manifest into toxic relationships, and how clinging onto the only good thing in your life may not actually be good, and it may not actually be good for you. And it is a reason that contributed to why I didn't like this book, but you're not supposed to like that element of this book. So I do think that if I'd have liked the other aspects in here, then I wouldn't have minded this so much, because a character does not actually have to be likable for me to enjoy the book, because sometimes that is just the point. The reason why I didn't like this, and you will see this in the next book I talk about as well, is that I do not like fantasy stories that are written in a contemporary style. It's why I do not read Holly Black. I can read a contemporary fantasy, but if there is a really contemporary tone to the writing, if it feels like a contemporary novel with a fantastical element, then I'm pretty much guaranteed not to like it, because I typically read just like straight fantasy, high fantasy, epic fantasy, and I don't really get on with contemporaries all that much in general. The magic system in here is like a very hazy, ever-shifting fairy world that's bordering on like fabulism with very little explanation. Once again, personal preference. I prefer a hard magic system with rules and limitations. I can enjoy books without that, but most of the time, if I'm not enjoying a book anyway, that will just completely make me not enjoy it at all. And yeah, overall, this was a miss for me. I really did not like it. I found it incredibly tedious to read. It was not an enjoyable experience. It isn't even that long, and it did take me quite a while to slog through it, because there were just so many elements of the narrative that I didn't like. If it wasn't written in like the contemporary style, then it was written in a really ambiguous way, which is something that I don't enjoy. So it was just a complete miss for me on every single level. But if you like or don't mind any of those other things, then it is very possible that you will enjoy this at least more than I did. And finally, the moment that you've all been waiting for but will come as a surprise to absolutely no one. My absolute worst book of the year was Infinity Son by Adam Silvera. I actually read this as a punishment for not completing my Bookopoly TBR, where I had to read the book that I'd last watched a rant review on. I had this book because it was an Illumicrate book, but I absolutely had no desire at all to read this, because while I do enjoy Adam Silvera's contemporary, there is nothing that I've ever read in any of his contemporary books that made me want to read a fantasy from him. So the storyline in here, we are following two brothers called Brighton and Emil, who have very different personalities. Emil is the nicer one of the two. He's a vegan, he cares about phoenixes, and he's just like, he's bland, but he's a decent guy. And then Brighton is an entitled content creator who wants to go viral. When he doesn't go viral, he's mad about it. He doesn't see why he's not the next big thing. And this is a contemporary fantasy. The story is set on the backdrop of New York City, but a New York City where we have two types of superheroes. The first type are the Celestials, and they have been gifted with powers, and the second type are the Spectres, and they have stolen their powers from drinking the blood of mythical animals and creatures like hydras and phoenixes and things like that. The brothers Emil and Brighton have always wanted to be Celestials, and they keep hoping that one day they will come into their powers. Eventually, throughout the course of this novel, one of them indeed does come into his power, and the other one is dragged along for the ride, and they end up embroiled in this big long-standing war between the Celestials and the Spectres. So there are so many things that I disliked about this book. The first one is the same as with Never Contented Things. Adam Silvera has a very contemporary writing style. I really don't like the voice that he gives his teenage characters, because it feels kind of uncomfortable and like an adult forcing themselves into the voice of a teenager, and it's just not quite right. If you've read any Adam Silvera book, I'm pretty sure you'll know the vibe that I'm talking about here, but it makes me uncomfortable to read. It just doesn't feel natural. Aside from those two main characters, we also follow a lot of the Celestials in here. There's a group of around 5 of them. One of them is one of the only characters I enjoyed, which is Maribel, and as a juxtaposition to Adam Silvera's normal writing style with teenage voices that I don't like, the voice of every single Celestial sounded the same, to the point where there was a scene with all of them in and just like kind of having a conversation. I had absolutely no idea which one was which. In fact, I was around 300 pages into the book, I believed, when I realized that Maribel, my favorite character, I could not remember what her power was because the Celestials were just really not well developed at all. The plot structure and like the plot twists wasn't great. Like, things would be introduced throughout the book and the main character would go into like a villain monologue type of thing where it's like, oh yeah, I knew this all along, I just didn't tell you, and then go on to explain this new element to the plot that had just been added and had no groundwork laid throughout the beginning of the book. I disliked both of the main characters in here, Brighton and Emil. I found Emil to be very boring, and I do think he is an infuriating character to read from the perspective of, because he just does not want anything that is happening in this book, which is like understandable, but the way that he like hesitates to save his friend because he doesn't like hurting people, like, it didn't make me feel empowered reading from his perspective. Him having superpowers did in no way make me think as I was reading it like, I wish I had superpowers, this is really cool, because of the way that he just hated everything that was happening to him. On the flip side of that, we have Brighton, who is the most obnoxious, entitled character that I have ever had the displeasure of reading from. Everything that's happening he complains about. Like, his brother gets powers and he complains about that. His YouTube channel is all about following Celestials and reporting on what they're doing and catching it on camera. He's like hyper focused on views and subscribers, and every time he makes a video and it doesn't go viral, even if it gets double the amount of views that his videos normally get, if it doesn't go viral, he's mad about it. So overall, not being able to get behind either of the characters was a big contribution to me really disliking this book. And then the one thing that gets me is that there's a plot twist at the end of this book that I would not have even considered to be a plot twist if I hadn't read Goodreads reviews of it and if my best friend had not said there was a plot twist at the end, because a plot twist implies something unexpected, and one of the characters did the most on-brand thing that they could ever do, and I'm supposed to be surprised about it. No, the whole thing with the end, I was thoroughly expecting that or something like it throughout the entirety of this novel. And then lastly, just things like the action scenes weren't very well written written. I couldn't understand the choreography of any fight scenes in here because it'd kind of be like a character who stood and kills somebody but then turns around and then kills somebody else, and just the way that everything was orchestrated, it was kind of like they were fighting in a cardboard box because there was no like traversing of any landscape in the narrative at all. So yeah, I really did not like this. I didn't expect to like it overly, but I did expect to not dislike it to the extent that I do, and you can 100% guarantee that I will not be picking up the sequels to this one. So that is it. Those are my 5 worst books of 2020. Please let me know down in the comments what your worst book of 2020 is, and please also don't forget to tune in tomorrow for the flip side of this video where we find out what my best books of 2020 are. But that's it for this video, guys, so please don't forget to like if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.